Hi, my name is Sydney Pearman, and this is my analysis of gender, sexism, and women's roles in the TV show Lessons in Chemistry. So just to start, just for an overview, kind of my main argument with this is that the show explores gender expression and challenges traditional gender roles for women throughout the story of Elizabeth Zott. And kind of my thesis is that the series highlights the inequality that women faced in 1950s, 60s America, and it kind of undermines these practices by depicting a woman who defies societal expectations, exposes sexism, and combats some of these systemic barriers that women face in the workforce in this male-dominated society. So, a little bit about Lessons in Chemistry. The story follows Elizabeth Stott, a woman chemist who faces severe discrimination, sexism, and struggles in her career trying to be a chemist, and after being fired she eventually begins hosting her own feminist cooking show in this era of 1960s America. So it's based on a book, Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis, which was published in 2022. And that book was such a hit that it was adapted into an Apple TV miniseries in 2023, starring Brie Larson as Elizabeth Stott, and it was developed and produced by Lee Eisenberg. And a fun fact is Brie Larson was also a producer in the show. So not only was she the lead, but she helped produce um, kind of the storyline based on the book. It's a historical drama, again, based in 1950s to 60s America. So just for some of that social and political context, this was a time when there were very strict gender roles enforced for women, very limited career opportunities for women, and women were just expected to be homemakers and mothers and wives, and that was kind of their sole purpose. But there was some emergence of social movements for women's rights and equality in this 1960s era following this discrimination. So going a little bit into the plot of the TV show, just really quickly, it starts with Elizabeth Zott as a PhD candidate at UCLA studying abiogenesis, which is her area of research. And she is sexually assaulted by her thesis advisor, Dr. Myers. And after defending herself, she is forced out of the college because they took his side and he retained his position. And she begins working at the Hastings Institute, which is a chemistry institute, where she is not taken seriously as a chemist. She's often mistaken as a secretary, and her work isn't taken seriously. So she begins to collaborate with Calvin Evans, another main character. He's a brilliant scientist that is renowned, and he works on her research with her, so it begins to be taken seriously. And throughout this, they kind of fall in love. That's kind of the side plot of it all. But he later dies tragically, and she becomes pregnant, which is kind of the twisting point of the series. After she is learned she's pregnant, she's fired from Hastings due to her pregnancy, and then her research gets stolen because all of her research got left in her office. Um, so flash forward, she raises her daughter with the help from her neighbor, who is a Black activist named Harriet Sloan. Another side plot to kind of the themes in this show. And then she later gets cast and stars in Supper at Six, which is a cooking show where she educates women on science and feminism and ends up becoming a national sensation. But at the end of the day, her true passion is science. So she quits that later on and she meets Calvin's birth mother, and she is um, in a position where she can fund her research and she's allowed to return to Hastings. So that's kind of the whole plot of the series beginning to end. Um, it goes a lot into women's roles in 1960s America. That's kind of the main focus of what we're going to be analyzing regarding this show. Um, because societal expectations for women at the time were just to be, as I previously said, homemakers, mothers, and wives. And the media played an important part in this, which is kind of attributed to the show where supposed to be a cooking host, but she does it differently than what is traditionally shown. The media portray women as doting housewives, or if not, they're otherwise unhappy and addicted to drugs. So kind of like purposefully gearing this media toward women to influence them to be a part of these norms. So cooking shows were a big part of that, and also just like house day-to-day shows where the wife is doting on the husband. And this kind of media portrayal of women to women at that time was analyzed in Women in Domesticity in the 1950s, an article by Wendy Gamber. That article also stated that mothers who entered the paid labor force aroused alarm and they were often blamed for children becoming delinquents because their mother figure wasn't present. Um, and this was kind of another tactic used to prevent women from being in the workforce. Um, so they had very limited workforce participation. And a big example of this from lessons in chemistry is that Elizabeth Zott had the same degree as most of the men that she worked with at the Hastings Institute, but they often confused her for a secretary because they couldn't even fathom that a woman could be a chemist. So the show also dives a lot into discrimination in the workplace, as I mentioned. Elizabeth is not allowed to pursue her research by herself simply because she is a woman, even though she shows that she is intelligent and she knows what she's talking about. Her work only gets funded after she partners with a man to do it, and that man was Calvin. After Calvin died, she was immediately fired. They were just looking for a reason, so the pregnancy kind of just gave them a reason to fire her, and then her work was stolen by the company, as I previously mentioned. So that kind of shows the unfair treatment of women in the workplace and double standards that they face and still face today. And her work really wasn't seen as hers, it was seen as his. And so after he died, the other scientists kind of felt entitled to that work, even though it was hers and she was still living. So that also demonstrates the concept of discrimination in the workplace. The concept that we discussed in this course, the glass ceiling, which creates various barriers that prevent qualified women from advancing in the workforce. So this has typically been attributed to women in management positions, but I feel like it fits in really well here because she's trying to become a real chemist and is just being halted at every step of the way from doing her research. And that is a perfect example of that glass ceiling concept. Also, the idea of the motherhood penalty, because after she becomes pregnant and has her child, she struggles to find work after that and becomes lucky with the TV show. But yeah, there's also still to this day gaps in women's involvement in STEM careers, which was analyzed in Gender in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Issues, Causes, and Solutions, a scientific article by Tessa Charlesworth. And this article kind of demonstrated the gender disparities within STEM careers that still occur to this day and still show notable gaps in representation and compensation between women and men. And there are also still long-standing biases in place regarding women's work ethic and performance abilities um, due to these long-standing biases and discrimination. So this kind of demonstrates how lasting this discrimination has been in the workforce for women, especially when pursuing degrees in sciences, because we still lack representation even to this day. It was hard in the 1960s, super hard in the 1960s. It's still hard now, even with all the improvements that we have made. So even though it's less extreme, it's still relevant to this day. Another important topic that's demonstrated in the show is male dominance and sexual exploitation. So it's the way that men in the series use their power to attempt to dominate Elizabeth, both in sexual and authoritative ways. So examples of this are Dr. Myers in the beginning, her thesis advisor at UCLA, attempting to rape her. And then she is forced out of UCLA for defending herself, even though he still retained his position and received no repercussions for that. So that is a bias against women, and he was using his position against her to try to get something from her. Also, when she gets fired for being pregnant, that is her boss, Dr. Donati. He uses this as an excuse to remove her, even though it's not even a real rule in the handbook that they have to fire pregnant women. It's just what they wanted to do. And then even after, when she's become successful in her TV career, Phil Lebensmall, her executive at the TV station, attempts to sexually assault her as well. And she pulls out a knife, which causes him to have a heart attack. And this actually ends up benefiting her because it kind of gives her the power over the TV show, and more freedom with it. So that was a case where it actually worked out in her favor, but it was still an attempt at male domination. Um, and this is expressed throughout the series. So there are multiple ways that the show challenges these gender norms. I wanted to go back to this scene of her getting fired because I feel it really shows her perseverance and determination and her intelligence, um, which was still ignored. She was still fired, but she tried at every turn to combat some of this discrimination. So she was fired from Hastings for being pregnant out of wedlock specifically. Um, and this scene kind of critiques the double standards faced by women regarding pregnancy and employment. So I just kind of wanted to play the clip because I felt like it shows the power of it.
Would the man be fired in this situation? That would be fair, correct?
What man are you referring to? Evans?
Any man. If an unwed woman gets pregnant, is the man who gets her pregnant responsible and therefore also fired? Would you fire Calvin?
Of course not.
Then you have no grounds to fire me.
Of course I do. You're the woman. You're the one who got knocked up. We have rules, Mrs. Ott.
Not for this. I have read the employee handbook front to back,
It's an unwritten rule.
and thus not legally binding.
So this clip kind of, again, shows what she is like as a character around every turn. Every time that she is discriminated against, she fights back and she attempts to be who she wants to be. But because she is a woman, she is held back from this. So her confrontation with her boss kind of highlights the unfair treatment of women in the workforce at this time and still to this day. Clearly, no one can get away with doing this now, but it goes back to historical normalcies that carry on. So this scene also shows her intelligence and perseverance as a character and demonstrates the ways in which Zot defies gender norms. So another way in which Elizabeth Zott breaks some of these traditional gender roles is through the TV baking show that she ends up being a part of after being fired from Hastings as a way to support her daughter. So after being hired for supper at 6, Zott doesn't act as a traditional cooking host would. She kind of discards the dress they put her in favor of a lab coat and glasses, as you can see in the right picture there. And this kind of goes against what we discussed earlier, that media depiction of how women should be. They clearly probably intended for her to just go on, cook what they wanted, promote what they wanted, but she didn't. She opted to instead teach women how to cook from a scientific viewpoint. And in one scene, she even urges a woman to go get her degree. So she really challenges traditional gender roles this way by promoting science and career aspirations for women. And countering some of those conventional portrayals of women as solely homemakers. So this is kind of what makes the series so groundbreaking in that way, is that you weren't seeing a lot of this at that time. But even though it's fiction, it does kind of resemble the fact that women aren't solely homemakers and mothers and wives, but they can do so much more than that. So basically, overall, Elizabeth Zott's treatment throughout these series demonstrates kind of the historical discrimination that women have faced, and the character is portrayed as strong and defiant, which breaks down some of those preconceived gender biases and proves that women are just as capable as men, even as mothers. And while the show is fiction, it's based on true events that women in the 60s faced that still carry through to today. And women may face far less discrimination today, but we are still largely unrepresented in the workforce and unequally treated, especially when it comes to women in STEM and in management positions. So some of my topics of discussion questions is how does lessons in chemistry work to challenge perceived gender roles of the time and highlight inequalities? So what is it that the show does to kind of point out how women are mistreated and have been mistreated historically? And then in what ways are the challenges that Elizabeth Zott faced in her life and career still applicable today? So as I mentioned previously, things are not as bad for women now, but there are still pay gaps. There are still workforce gaps in the amount of people in STEM in management positions that are women. So that is something that needs to still be analyzed and resolved. Here are some of my resources, including articles related to analyzing lessons in chemistry, just as a show, and some context of 1960s decade women. And here's my works cited. Thank you very much.